Back when I played this game in 2019, I was always hearing that this game was being described as Skyrim, but without the magic. So I bought it, played it, and I cursed it during the first few hours of the game. The description, Skyrim, but without magic, couldn't be further from the truth. Though that doesn't mean it's a bad game. We'll be talking about a few key points regarding the game's story, gameplay, and replay value. And at the end, we'll have a final verdict to answer the question, is Kingdom Come Deliverance worth playing in 2024? I hope you guys are ready for a history lesson, because we're about to go back in time. The game takes place in the medieval kingdom of Bohemia, which is an imperial state of the Holy Roman Empire. You might ask why I feel the need to explain that, and besides it being the description of the game in Wikipedia, being historically accurate was also one of the main points of the game. That being said, I wouldn't be starting a history class teaching all the things that happen in the game as fact. Enough of the introduction though, let's dive in, starting with the game's story. When you boot the game up, there's always a cutscene where they explain the setting and basically the events that happened before the game starts. The cutscene explains that King Charles IV was loved by all. Under his reign, the lands grew and prospered in peace. Of course, not even a king as beloved as him could beat death, and so when he took his final rest, the empire was passed to his son, Wenceslas IV. Except he didn't inherit his father's knack for ruling. Instead of actually ruling, Wenceslas IV indulged in more fun affairs, such as good food and women. Soon enough, the nobility started complaining and called on King Sigismund of Hungary, Wenceslas' brother, for help. Sigismund decided to kidnap the king and basically took the kingdom by force, which is where we find ourselves at the beginning of the game. Your name is Henry, the son of a blacksmith in the peaceful settlement of Skalitz. You wake up one day after sleeping in and you're called upon by your mom and dad to do a set of errands for the day. You do the errands, and with a quick fist fight, sword fighting practice, and basically the whole tutorial in between, you return to your father. Here is where you meet Sir Radzig, a main recurring character in the game. You've actually been helping your father craft a sword for Sir Radzig. While it's a magnificent blade, Radzig never gets to wield it in battle since suddenly a mysterious force gathers on the horizon. An army of raiders led by a bald veteran form in a menacing line. A rain of fire arrows is volleyed and the enemy cavalry advance. Everyone in Skalitz run in a mass panic. Your father jumps into the fray to save your mom in the village while you grab supplies from the house and the sword for Sir Radzig. Henry then makes his way to the castle and sees the destruction caused by the raiders. He rushes towards the flames to an entrance in the inner wall that separates the blacksmith from the rest of the village. He sees his father fighting off the raiders one by one, all while protecting his wife. The enemies prove too much though, and in the end, the enemy leader runs through the blacksmith down on horseback, leaving Henry's mother defenseless in the middle of the chaos. Henry sees all this happen before his eyes and is stunned. He'd been secretly learning how to use a sword to help protect himself, as he always wanted to explore the world outside of Skalitz. It seems that it was a bit too much for him when the real world started breaking down his door. The raiders now set their eyes on Henry, holding Sir Radzig's sword. Henry's no fool though, and realizes he's outmatched. He runs back to the castle, but the bridge has already been raised. The guards shout at him to run to the back through a secret passage and send word to Talmberg, 2 settlements over. Henry runs downhill and sees Theresa, another stable character in the game, in a 1v3 situation not in favor of her. Henry swiftly distracts the three before bolting away, but just giving Theresa enough time to escape. Henry rides towards Talmberg, but the raiders are on his tail, shooting arrows at him too. Along the path, he sees the settlement of Rovna already razed to the ground and scattered villagers being picked off one by one. Henry takes an arrow to the thigh but pushes on regardless. He reaches Talmberg and the castle archers stop the chasers in their tracks, allowing Henry safe passage into the castle. As the captain of the guard and the castle men tend to Henry, they take care of his wound in the form of hot wine, bandages, and the equivalent of a 3-2-1 countdown before the dentist pulls a tooth out of your mouth. Henry passes out from the pain for a bit, but comes to his senses rather quickly. The wound, now all bandaged up, is as good as it's ever gonna get, and it's time for Henry to report the attack to the lord of the castle, Sir Divish. Henry says all he knows of the event, and it's here that we find that the attackers may be Cumans from Sigismund's army. After the talk with Sir Divish, you're led to the castle kitchen for some food, then to a room for some rest. While sleeping, Henry is woken by a friendly face, Lady Stephanie, who we were introduced to in the kitchen and is Sir Divish's wife. You have a friendly chat, share stories together, and when she leaves, Henry goes back to sleep. It's not so peaceful though, as nightmares of the raid haunt Henry, as well as the dead bodies of his parents asking for help. It's clear to Henry what he must do. He must go back to bury his parents. Henry escapes Talmberg using a method previously only known to the Dragonborn in Skyrim and starts traveling back towards Skalitz. The aftermath of the massacre is still fresh. The roads still littered with dead bodies, and the church at Rovna, where most of the dead were stacked and burned, paint a grim picture of what happened. After passing Rovna, Henry meets a few criminals along the road. Grave robbers. Good thing he still has that sword on him. Henry not so gracefully deals with these savages and heads off to what was previously the village's main area for trade, though it's nearly unrecognizable at this point. It's here that Henry spots his girlfriend, Bianca, and his parents, all lifeless on the ground. He tries to find a shovel, but finds Zbyszek instead, gathering scraps from the aftermath. Henry argues with him to stop the grave robbing, and Zbyszek runs off, leaving Henry with the shovel he needs. He starts digging his parents' grave under the linden tree beside their house. When he returns to Carrie's parents though, Zbyszek had already returned and with a few friends of his. The mercenaries, taking a liking to the sword Henry had on him, start robbing him successfully. Before he's sent to the great beyond though, Theresa suddenly appears out of nowhere, standing like some kind of superhero, and for good reason too. Sir Robard with a handful of men on horseback charge at the mercenaries, cutting them down one by one. Henry passes out, again, and while out cold he's carried onto a wagon. His parents are properly buried by Sir Robard and his men, and the long journey back begins. Also, did I mention that the opening credits were being rolled out while this was happening? Yep, you guessed it, all of that was just the fucking intro of the game. The real game actually starts after you get hauled over to Ratai, which is a town on the other side of the region, and your options really open up from there. As far as the story goes, however, let me say that it includes a lot of bandits, lords, nobles, small and large scale battles, and even a freaking castle siege. To be honest, the intro was a perfect start to the game. It had everything. Tutorials, likable characters, intense chases, combat, and chill wholesome moments. It's a glimpse of what's to come, and this is actually one of the games that I can confidently say that it was the story that helped me push through to finish the game, rather than the gameplay. The gameplay is well, don't get me wrong, but we'll be talking about a few pitfalls and cons that really pushed this game down a notch for me. Best get to it then. Let's move on and talk about the gameplay. Kingdom Come Deliverance plays in the first-person perspective. On mouse and keyboard, you look around with the mouse and move around with the WASD keys. For the map, you press M and you'll soon realize that most of the map is covered with something similar to Fog of War in a MOBA. To be able to permanently see these spots on the map, you'll have to physically travel to them. In a game where technology hasn't really advanced too much yet, you'd think that walking around would be too tedious to get around at some point, and you'd be right. Luckily, like most open world games, there's a fast travel system, but with a little added spice to that, and I'll get to that later on. While KCD seems to be an average run-of-the-mill medieval RPG, it's worth noting that there are survival mechanics in the game. You'll have to manage your energy level, hunger, and to some extent, your cleanliness too. It doesn't get in the way of the game too much, but the effects of not taking the time to manage these properly are immediately felt. Always make sure to eat well and get your beauty sleep, and Henry will get by just fine. This game is set in medieval times, and nothing says medieval better than trial by combat. Kingdom Come's combat system was something I'd never seen at the time for this genre. When entering combat, 5 lines appear around your crosshair, making a star-like shape. These represent the angles where you can swing your weapon. Moving your mouse towards the direction of the lines highlights them and moves your right arm to that position. Clicking left click initiates a swing from that direction, but you can hold it so Henry pulls for a swing, but you can change the direction of the swing last second. Right click is a stab that is faster and goes right down the middle. After getting better at combat, you can chain attacks and even complete combos that have an unblockable final hit. This would have been really awesome, except for the fact that it doesn't really matter where you swing that much, since the options given to you for defense cover all directions. All weapons, except bows, have the ability to block, and all you have to do to block is hold Q. Overhead swing, Q. Upper right swing, Q. Lower left swing, Q. Yep, you don't have to actually aim the block. You just have to keep your guard up and you're safe. for a while. I added that last part because blocking drains stamina, and when your stamina gets depleted in combat, you're as good as dead. There's an easy fix for that though. When an enemy swings, you'll notice that your center dot will turn into a green shield icon. If you press Q at that time, you execute a perfect block which drains no stamina. You can also press A, S, or D to move away from the swing to dodge the attack. This dumbed down the combat a lot, since it just really devolved into me looking at the center dot and waiting for the green shield icon to appear. Now, what made the combat worse was that when you get really good at blocking, Henry can start doing perfect counters when blocking at the right times. This is where Henry parries the attack and counterattacks in one motion. If you consider that enemies can get really good at blocking too, you'll soon realize that there's no point in attacking, since enemies will just perfect counter you, giving you no chance of chaining your strikes. This lowered the combat into a turtle competition during the later part of the game where enemy stats are quite high. There's also mounted combat, which isn't that good since one hit from anything other than an arrow will knock you off your horse, but if you get good at it, you're a nightmare for the AI. Lastly, and I saved the worst for last, the combat system shows its greatest flaws when fighting multiple enemies. The combat system was obviously made with single combat in mind. Switching from enemy to enemy is a nightmare on mouse and keyboard, and since the camera aggressively locks onto the first enemy, the others are free to circle around you and swing with no hope of you blocking. If you run after getting hit, you will always be chased down since getting hit depletes your stamina, so most encounters where you're against 3 or more will almost certainly end in death, and death in this game is quite unforgiving. Maybe I was just playing the game wrong or I was missing a crucial combat mechanic, but I highly doubt it. Despite the bad rep I'm giving this combat system, where it really shines is when you're put into one-on-one combat with a high-level enemy. To be honest, it actually makes sense that fighting multiple enemies is super hard, since no matter how good of a swordsman you are, you're probably not getting out of a bandit ambush alone in one piece. I mean, the game does go from a realism perspective here. I mentioned how death can be unforgiving in this game, and the reason behind that is this saving system. The game saves through autosaves at certain points in the story, when sleeping in select beds out in the wilderness or on one you own, and when you exit the game. However, the main way of saving in this game is through the use of a consumable called Savior Schnapps. It's an alcoholic drink you can buy from taverns, herbalists, or apothecaries, but you can also craft them through the herbalism skill. Every time you save, you have to drink one of these. Make sure you always have a few in hand, since this game can get really challenging at times and you'll want to make sure you have a quick save before trying out a bunch of things and potentially ruin the quest. So the combat's rough on the edges and you don't want to go off getting unalived in the wilderness after not being able to save due to not having any Savior Schnapps. What do? Well, you get stronger, of course. Progression is one of the key points in the game, in my opinion. You start off as a blacksmith's son, barely knowing anything about the world and how to wield a sword, but you gradually turn into a menace in steel plate, galloping across the land while culling all bandits in sight. To get from point A to B, you'll need to get better at the skills you need to survive. There's plenty of them in the game and you get to pick which of them you want to get better at. The more you do one thing, the more natural it feels for Henry. Using a bow before level 5 without an armband is a surefire way to get your arms flayed. After 5 though, you can do without them and Henry can draw the bow a bit faster. Using and blocking with any weapon will raise that weapon's skill level, your defense level, and your warfare level. Sneaking and pickpocketing will suck at first, but there's skills that pay off in the long run if you want to go doing some mischief in the night. Those go for all the skills, but not only do you notice Henry getting slightly better at doing things with each level increase, at certain levels you also get perks that you can use to define how Henry uses that skill. There are some skills that lock you out of another when taken, so make sure to think a bit before claiming the perk, but for the most part, as long as you get good with combat skills and maybe a bit of speech, reading, and stealth, you should be good. Let's talk about how dialogue works in the game. You can talk to almost all the NPCs. Most of the general NPCs, you'll just have different answers for the same questions, but the dialogue choices really matter when it comes to the quest lines. Henry has a speech skill that increases every time you speak to someone. The more perks you have in this skill, the easier it will be to persuade people to your liking. It's not all about having a higher number though. Other things are taken into account, like your reputation with the NPC, your motives, and their purpose in that situation. There's a lot that goes into the dialogue choices in this game, but for the most part, when an important dialogue choice pops up, you're shown 3 numbers on the bottom left. These numbers represent how you fare in terms of what they think about you, I think. There's a tutorial for this, just read it when it pops up. If your number is higher than that of the NPC, you'll most likely succeed with persuading them, but that doesn't mean they'll like your choice. You could have higher numbers for all three, but you'll get a different response for each of them, so choose how you think your version of Henry would deal with the situation. Expanding on the reputation during dialogues, you also have reputation for the settlements you visit. Increasing your reputation with the individual NPCs will contribute to an increase in the settlement's overall reputation as well. I don't really see the benefits of being in good standing for a settlement. It's a minor mechanic that had little bearing for my playthroughs, but there could be something there that I never really noticed. Now I want to touch a little bit more on the questing in this game. What I loved about the questing is how much things can be changed based on what you do. And the game isn't afraid of making you deal with the consequences of your actions. If you cross the line with brute forcing your way through a quest, you'll probably end up in jail, unalived by the guards, or just plain get locked out of completing the quest. On the other hand, if you find you just can't sneak through an area because someone always gets in the way, well, let's just say nobody's going to miss a guard or two if they go missing. There's a bunch of ways you can go through the questing here, just make sure to save before trying anything unique. Unfortunately, there's a lot of quests that make you go from one settlement to another and back again. While the landscape of the game is quite therapeutic to gallop around your horse with, a wise man once said, "Ain't nobody got time for that." When discovering settlements and some unique places, you can unlock fast travel points that you can use to, well, fast travel. Fast traveling isn't that fast though. Henry actually travels to the place, you just see it on the map and time moves on. This sounds like a chill way to travel once you've had your fill of exploring the open world on horseback, but you'll still need to stay on your toes. On your fast travels, you'll sometimes run into random events on the road. These events range from scared villagers, obstacles on the road, bandit ambushes, and even small skirmishes between bandits and humans, which you would be wise to stay out of. These random events actually happen in real time too, and there are some paths that have a higher chance of getting a random event, but I assure you, you'll find yourself fast traveling around the world more than 70% of the whole game. If you do decide to stray from the beaten path though and into the woods to explore, look out for interesting sites that may hold hidden treasures or gear. Speaking of the woods, the woodland areas in this game are dense and full of annoying bushes and trees that collide with you and your horse, determined to not let you pass, as if they were Gandalf holding off a Balrog. Moreover, while the ambient sounds of the woods can feel enchanting at first, there's actually not much to do here. All the woods are just filled with the same three animals: hares, boars, and deer. No wild dogs, no wolves, or bears of any kind. No scary witchcraft in the night either. The emptiness of the woods was a big hit for me since 40% of the map is full of forests. Now before we wrap up the gameplay section, I just want to talk about the available DLCs really quick. We've got Treasures of the Past DLC that gives you a few ancient maps that lead to good loot. Nothing too crazy. The Sir Hans DLC has you become a wingman for Hans Capon while he pursues a life of love. Of course, things aren't as simple as they seem, and where nobles are involved, usually so is trouble. Band of Bastards is a great DLC about patrolling the countryside from bandits and the likes with an old acquaintance of Sir Radzig's. That one gets quite emotional and I really like that DLC. From the Ashes is great for those who love settlement building games, since you'll be in charge of rebuilding the once bandit infested land of Pribyslavitz. Last but not the least, we've got a woman's lot. Stay away from this DLC. Just kidding. This one is the largest of the DLCs and has you play the game from the perspective of Theresa. You finally figure out how she survived the attack on Skalitz, how she managed to save you back in the base game's intro, and much more. Do note though that this DLC kind of takes over your main playthrough as Henry. Make sure you have a save file ready just before you start this DLC, just in case you'd like to go back from it. I personally couldn't finish a woman's lot. I was so used to playing as my jacked up Henry that restarting as Theresa took too much relearning of the game for me. Not that it's a bad DLC, I just couldn't bring myself to complete it. With that out of the way, we now move on and talk about the game's replay value. I can't say how long it took me to finish the game since I had hours in the game from when I played back in 2019. It probably took me a good 80 hours of gameplay though to beat the base game, and maybe half of that time for the DLCs. When it comes to replay value, I would say it's the game's weak point, but it also adds to its charm. There's no NG Plus where you can restart the game with all your levels at max, but knowing how the game works would probably open up a few more experiments to try when going for another run. The best this game offers in terms of replay value is that you can free roam just before finishing the last epilogue quest. Not really that exciting, but as I said earlier, it adds to the charm. Naturally, all stories have to come to an end, and the game's ending satisfied me. Seeing Henry grow from being a peasant blacksmith to a renowned squire pseudo-knight thingy felt awesome. You could feel that the key people in the game reacted to Henry's efforts and start respecting him more, which in turn granted more weight with his decisions. That being said, a great story can only be truly best experienced the first time around, so going for another playthrough didn't appeal to me that much. So, did Kingdom Come Deliverance deliver? I think it did. I think the combat system is good but needs a great deal of polish. There's not much replay value, but the first time experience makes up for that. The story, as the star of the show, carried this game for me. Your interaction with the characters, the setting, Henry's growth, and the secrets that get revealed all perfectly fit together to create a great medieval RPG. But do be prepared for the learning curve and how realistically unfair some situations can be. This game requires a lot of patience, but if you can get through the slow early game, you're in for a great story. Thanks for watching this far into the video. I hope you liked the content, and if you did, consider liking the video and clicking on subscribe. Your support means a ton and it helps me push out these videos despite a busy schedule. Stay tuned for my next game reviews. If you got a game that you want me to review, let me know in the comments and I'll check it out. Stay safe out there and have a great day ahead.